My name is Michael Grover. I'm the Community Affairs Officer here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and I want to welcome you all to our roundtable event on employee financial capability. As our invite showed, or as our invite talked about, studies show that when employees are anxious about their financial lives, the stress can affect employers' bottom lines by contributing to productivity losses, absences, higher health care premiums, turnover, and more. However, employers can play a unique and important role in helping employees improve their financial health. The roundtable event today is designed to inform employers and other key stakeholders about partnerships, programs, and best practices that can improve employee financial well-being, especially for those employees with lower incomes. So you may be asking yourself, why is the Federal Reserve interested in this topic? For some time now, the Federal Reserve has been interested in understanding more about the effect of disparities on individuals in the economy. In fact, as a part of its overall mission, the Federal Reserve has a long-standing interest in improving economic outcomes in low-income communities. Much of this work takes place in the community development departments located in each reserve bank, and that's where I work here at the Minneapolis Fed. The organizations co-sponsoring the event today also share this broad interest in improving economic outcomes in low-income communities. And they also share a particular interest in improving and finding ways to improve employee financial well-being. So at this point in time, I just want to introduce some of the partners we have today, because I think these folks have contributed in a variety of ways to what the agenda looks like today, and hopefully and contributing to the discussion going forward. Prepare and Prosper. Prepare and Prosper is a nonprofit organization that helps Minnesotans to move out of poverty by providing pathways to increased income, building assets, and becoming financially secure, and by advocating for change that breaks down barriers to financial success. They do this by providing free tax assistance each year, and by partnering with financial institutions and community organizations to expand access to financial services. Another key partner for this event today is the Greater Twin Cities United Way. With its mission of building pathways toward prosperity and equity for all, the United Way is keenly focused on fighting for better funding for early childhood ed, providing food, shelter, and health care resources for people in need through its 211 hotline, partnering with the community in order to better understand the causes and solutions for poverty, and the closing of the gaps in access to education and jobs. And finally, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce has also been a key partner for us. The Chamber of Commerce is the state's largest business organization, representing more than 23 businesses of all types and sizes, and offering solutions to those businesses to advocate, connect, and grow. Please join me in thanking our partners today for putting on this event. Thank you. In addition to those of you who are attending the event here in the room today, I also want to welcome those who are watching on the bank's live stream channel or joining the conversation about employee financial capability on social media, namely through using the hashtag FinHealth, FINHEALTH. So thank you for all who are participating in the discussion. And this just gives you a sense of the hashtag and some of the Twitter handles of some of the organizations involved, as well as some of the speakers. So if you're on Twitter, these are some of the key resources that you need to use. So you all have event folders, except for you online. If you could just take them out for a second, I just want to talk a little bit about what you have in your folder in terms of handouts. In addition to the event agenda today, there are detailed speaker bios for all of today's presenters. So please use that as a resource as we move forward in the morning, because oftentimes we'll provide a short introduction for the speaker, but there's more details there. We've also included several handouts, including presentation slides for our keynote presenter, Ray Bashara, who I'll introduce momentarily. Ray has a number of different articles that are key points of discussion for the conversation we're going to have today. Also, as I'll mention in a moment too, his center at the St. Louis Fed provides a lot of good information, data, and research on this topic. Lastly, since this is our first conversation on this topic of financial capability as it relates to employers being involved, we're very interested in your thoughts and ideas about next steps or additional conversations that are needed. Some of the discussion will happen today during our small groups, but we also plan to send out an electronic survey to gather information from all of you following the event. So that will get in your email boxes. You'll get another email from me. So that'll enter your email boxes either later today or early tomorrow. And we'd appreciate your honest feedback about the event, as well as ideas for carrying the conversation forward. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker and my colleague and friend from the St. Louis Fed, Ray Bashara. Ray is a senior advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, where he also directs the Center for Household Financial Stability. The center conducts research on family wealth and how wealth matters for families and the economy. He's also a senior fellow in the Financial Security Program at the Aspen Institute. Ray's been a great resource to me and to others across the Federal Reserve System and across the nation for his ideas about asset building, wealth, and how households have been faring during this trying time after the recession. We've asked Ray to kick off our event today by placing what we're going to be talking about within a broader context and discussion that is currently underway in the country about financial instability. So please join me in welcoming Ray Bashara to the podium.
Thank you. Grab your water. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. There we are, getting organized. Thank you, Michael, and all the co-sponsors. I've really been looking forward to this event ever since Michael contacted me, I think back in the spring. So it's a real honor and privilege to be here. It's actually my very first time in Minneapolis, if you can believe that. So what a great way to start. I was supposed to come to Minneapolis 20 years ago, a girl I'd met on a bike trip, and of course camping, and she was in Minnesota, I was in DC, and I was planning on coming. I never made it, the relationship fell apart, but not before she sent me a book called How to Talk Minnesotan, which I found very amusing. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But I remember one scene where they're describing an election, and the candidate who said nothing, who had really no clear policy positions, whose answer to every question was, "I'm not sure," was the guy who won the election. So I don't know what that means. But anyway, it's great to be here, and I need to say, of course, that these are my own views and not necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So let me get started here. Here's an overview of my remarks. What's my key message? I'll say a little bit about the context for why we're here, which is widespread financial instability, as Michael mentioned. 3 lessons that I think that we've learned from our research at the St. Louis Fed about why we need to think about assets, what we've learned about assets. A couple of thoughts on what this research means for employee financial wellness, and just a couple of ideas on moving forward. But before I go on, I also want to have a real shout out to Michael and his colleagues here at the Minneapolis Fed, longtime friends and colleagues. And I think the conference that they put on back in the spring on early investment starting right was probably one of the best Fed conferences, if not one of the best conferences I've ever been to. So real kudos to Michael and his team here in Minneapolis. Okay, so I think this is pretty obvious that financial instability is widespread. We wouldn't be here if we didn't all think that. I'm not going to go through all the different statistics. I pulled them together for you just as a reference point, along with a quote from PricewaterhouseCoopers on why employers should care about this issue. But I think you know, I think it's either a near or a clear majority of Americans, have weak balance sheets, and that weak family balance sheets underlie each of these statistics. Okay, there's a something about wealth that's contributing a lot to this widespread financial instability. One way to think about it is to think about the difference between weather and climate change. Okay, I'm going to borrow a little something here from my colleague at Aspen, Ida Rademacher. So financial instability, volatility, living on the edge, that's weather. That's what you can see. That's what you can feel. We all see it on the news. We all live it. Families see it. That's weather. But weak balance sheets, that's climate change, right? That's the deeper forces underlying financial instability among many families, fueling severe weather and growing financial instability. So I'm here to talk about this economic climate change that I think underlies financial instability among families. Now, of course, there are other elements of climate change, financial climate change, productivity growth not being strong, lack of inclusive or broad-based growth, decline of unions, public policies and safety nets not being as strong as they, there's a lot of things going on underneath that contribute to widespread financial instability. But I want to talk about the balance sheet contribution to that, to this economic climate change that I'm calling it here. And my hope is that, by the end of my brief talk here, you're going to see that wealth is key to understanding and addressing employee financial instability. And by understanding what's driving wealth outcomes, you'll have a better sense of how to target your own employee financial wellness efforts. Okay, so that's kind of my goal here. All right, so let's start with the three lessons. The first is that assets matter in unique ways, but asset policies have not been inclusive. So many of you might know that this whole field of building assets started in 1991 with a book called Assets and the Poor by a Washington University in St. Louis professor, Michael Sheridan. And he basically said, you get two things when you have assets. You get better economic outcomes, you have a cushion to fall back on, you have a base for making future investments. But also, when you own assets, you have distinct psychological, civic, health, child well-being, political, a whole range of benefits that you get with owning assets that you don't get with similar amounts of income. There's a very distinct set of outcomes that are associated with that. So that was his theory, and 25 years later, we actually have an evidence base now around both of these propositions. And let me just mention a couple of findings here with regards. So the first is that assets they are really key for economic security and upward economic mobility. Pew, when Jeremy was there, put out a study showing that of the three types of capital, financial, human, and social, that financial capital is really the key to upward economic mobility. It's critical in determining which kids move up the economic ladder and which don't. And then Dalton Conley, a professor who was at NYU and now at Princeton, did a very careful analysis and found that net worth really is the key determinant of which kids move up and which ones don't. It's how families truly get ahead. These are two of many studies showing that wealth really is key to economic security. And there's other studies that I'll talk about in a minute showing that wealth is key in determining who does not fall back when they have a crisis or some kind of hardship. So the second finding about holding assets is associated with distinct social, psychological, emotional, and other outcomes. So there's now evidence that when you have an asset, when a family has an asset, there are better expectations for the future, confidence, children's cognitive health, mothers' mental health, educational outcomes, lower student debt outcomes. There's a whole range of outcomes that have been well documented in a 2008 book that really showing that holding assets has distinct outcomes not related, that are attributable to holding the assets themselves. Now, I will qualify and just say that these are not causal. We don't know for sure that holding the asset caused these outcomes, but the associations are pretty strong and pretty compelling. And I would also just add a qualification that in future research, we need to be more clear about which asset leads to which kind of outcome. So I think that's the future of this agenda going forward. Nonetheless, the associations that we have so far are really quite compelling. And then the final point I'd make here is that the U.S. does, in fact, have a long history of promoting property ownership, but many families were and remain excluded from those policies. Historically, we had the Homestead Act and the GI Bill, great policies. They're responsible for a lot of property ownership in the U.S. But both the Homestead Act and the GI Bill largely excluded African Americans and other minorities. And, of course, there was redlining historically. This was enshrined in law. Richard Rothstein has a new book on this. He's going to be featured here, actually, in a few weeks at the Minneapolis Fed, talking about the color of law. So, there's a long history of exclusion with these policies. And today, we don't really have the legal exclusion, but we have exclusion through tax policy. And so right now, asset building primarily happens because people get pretty generous tax breaks for building wealth. And the more you make, the larger the tax break. So it's highly regressive. And the very people who need to accumulate wealth really don't benefit from these policies. So, tax policy is part of the structure of wealth inequality today. And a lot of the work that we've done in the field, and when I was at New America, was trying to make the tax code more inclusive. And so the way we think about property ownership and assets is how do you include people in a policy that already exists? And that's really the goal of a lot of our work. So, move on to our second finding here. At our center in particular, we've found that demographic factors increasingly matter for building wealth. And we focused on demographic factors because income is actually not a really good or stable predictor of who's building wealth, in part because having wealth predicts income and having income predicts wealth. It's hard to sort out what's driving what. Incomes are more volatile, whereas these demographic drivers are more stable and we found more predictive than they were even a generation ago in determining who builds wealth and who does not. In the Fed's survey of consumer finances, which new data just came out recently, we're able to look at three factors: age and birth year, secondly, education, and third, race and ethnicity. And I'm going to say a little bit about each of those. Other data show that gender and family structure also matter for building wealth. We don't really have good data on gender to make, I think, clear claims about that, but the folks who are working in that area show that the disparities are not unlike what you see for blacks and Hispanics. Anywhere from 10, women in general have about anywhere from 10 to 30% of the wealth of men, even controlling for other factors. And then family structure, I think, is important. The problem is, other forces drive family structure itself. It's hard to say that family structure per se, but nonetheless, if you look at the correlations, single-parent families are at a huge disadvantage in terms of building income and wealth and financial stability for themselves and for their families. So I have a chapter in your packet there about demographic destiny. Is demography destiny? Can it overcome? If you want to hear more about this, but we've basically found that demography is not destiny, but it is increasingly powerful in determining who builds wealth and who does not. Basically, being older, being better educated, and being white or Asian means that you're what we call a thriver. You have tailwinds behind you, making it easier for you to build wealth than 30 years ago. Whereas strugglers, as we call them, minority, less educated, younger Americans, basically face headwinds You know, like having these demographic features has penalties more than a generation ago. And so these demographic drivers are like sorting mechanisms. They're sorting people into thrivers and strugglers more than they did a generation ago. So it's among the divides in America. It's the ways that America is getting sorted into winners and losers. Bob Putnam's new book, a couple years now, Our Kids, you know, he says the fault line is whether your parents are married and educated, and that's what's dividing the 1/3 of Americans from the 2/3 who don't have those. But we're focusing on these demographic drivers. So let me just walk briefly through the three drivers. I think there's something unique about the three drivers that, you know, that we're able to study at the St. Louis Fed. So the first is age or birth year, and so we call this our. It's actually the most powerful of the three predictors that we looked at, and actually it ended up being the most surprising too, precisely because it was the most powerful of our predictors. The reason we distinguish between age and birth year is because age maybe is a little bit obvious, right? You expect older people to have more wealth than younger people, of course, but what we're talking about is comparing young people today to young people a generation ago, comparing your wealth to your parents or grandparents at a similar point in time. And then birth year matters because we're all born into an economic moment in history. And so it matters, you know, the size of your birth cohort. It matters if there are robust public policies. Was the economy booming? Were you born during a recession? You know, it turns out that these actually matter quite a bit in determining your economic prospects. And so, for example, the kids born during the Great Depression have actually been the most successful economically because they had a much smaller cohort to compete with in the labor market, but they also benefited from a lot of great public policies that came of age when they were working and raising kids. So, you know, I think there's an important distinction here between age and birth year, and this shows up in our data. So, as you can see from the data, you know, older Americans, those 62 and over, are doing quite well. Their typical wealth, the median wealth of those families is $235. It's risen quite a bit since 1989, which our data started. Middle-aged Americans took a huge hit in the recession, as you can see, and that's largely because they were overinvested in home ownership. And many middle-aged families are still struggling with that, but they've started to rebound. But look at the flat line among younger Americans. It's been about the same, you know, since 1989. Their numbers are not going up. And again, this is not a panel. We're looking at, you know, younger Americans in 1989 compared to younger Americans today, and you can see that they're not making progress. As a matter of fact, we have stats showing that an American born in 1970 is on track to have about 40% less wealth over their lifetime than somebody born in 1940. All right? So there's something going on with this generation. And there's a lot of explanations for it, we think. The fact that many of them were born into a rough economic moment. They're having to finance their education with student loans. They're working in the gig economy. The safety net's not as generous. All these things seem to matter. But it is historical that perhaps for the first time in history, we're having a generation that's not going to do as well, better than its parents or grandparents, at least in terms of wealth, which is odd in many ways because they're doing better in terms of education, but it's not translating into more wealth. So anyway, I'll say a little bit more about younger Americans and middle-aged Americans later on. But that's what we've learned so far, and we're going to have a research symposium next year dedicated to this very topic, how birth year and age, you know, the generational outcomes associated over time. So education. So we call this our most deceptive finding. Here you can see that the correlations are phenomenally powerful, right? So those with a graduate degree, typical, the median wealth, somebody with a graduate or professional degree is $443,000 net worth. With college, 228, and then it goes down to 76 and down to 65 for those, you know, with either some college or a degree or or no high school. And so, the correlations are very strong. But we have other data showing that only those with college and graduate degrees have built wealth over the last generation. They're the only ones whose wealth is increasing, especially those with graduate and professional degrees have built wealth over the last 30 years. But but it is a little deceptive because with education, it's a little tricky. It's not unlike income in some ways, although it's a little bit more fixed once you have it. Is education driving wealth or is wealth driving education? And of course, both are true. What I'm showing here is the extent to which having education is correlated with having more wealth. But, again, it's deceptive because is college really just a marker? Would people who did not go to college have built wealth anyway? And I look at my brother. My brother and I are about the same age. He barely got through high school, but we have similar levels of wealth today. Was it family background? Was it grit? Was it hard work, determination? We both have that, but he applied it to the restaurant business and did very well. So you just have to be careful here. But having said all that, I think it's very clear that this is by far the most important asset that families can have in the 21st century. The correlations are strong, and I think we should do everything we can to support kids who are capable and ready to advance their skills as much as possible. Okay, race and ethnicity was the third driver that we looked at. We call this our most disturbing finding. If you can see the graph here, whites, about $163,000 in net worth. This new category of other is really Asians and anybody who identifies as something other than white, black, or Hispanic. It's mostly Asians, but it's not just Asians. And then, of course, you see the numbers for blacks and Hispanics way down at the bottom of 21 and 16. So overall, blacks and Hispanics have had about 10% of the wealth of whites. And as you can see from the chart, because of the volatility on the high end, that number changes a lot, but you can also see that blacks and Hispanics basically have flatlined over the last 25 years. Their wealth hasn't really gone anywhere. And now in the recent data that came out, there's been an improvement, increases among blacks and Hispanics. They actually had the largest percentage increases in wealth, 29%. But keep in mind that even with that improvement, you're talking about typical wealth of an African-American family of only $16,000. You compare what you can do with 160 versus 16, and you can see that's a big difference. I would also point out that other research we have shows if you look at families that have $1,000 or less in net worth, it's 1 in 9 white families, 1 in 4 Hispanic, and 1 in 3 blacks. So, the disparities are very real. And on the retirement front, we just ran some numbers here, which even shocked us. A white high school dropout has about the same level of retirement savings as a black with a graduate or professional degree. They both have about $20,000. All right, there's something else going on here, right? And I think there is something else going on here, right? And if you look at blacks and whites with similar incomes, similar family backgrounds, similar education, if you control for all those things, there's still a huge gap. So the only thing you can conclude is that the cumulative effect of not having opportunities to build wealth for 2 centuries, the effects of redlining, a whole range of policies. This is the cumulative effect of all these efforts to make sure that African American others could not build wealth. These structural elements in our research and others are still very powerful and enduring to today, and they're very difficult to overcome. So, I just want to, the point here is that economically we are far from a post-racial America. We might be there legally, politically, but we are not there economically, and that's the important point here. So to think that if somehow black families just somehow manage their money better, that they're going to, that's going to close the gap, the research says that that's just not true. Because even when you control for everything, you still have these large outcomes. Finally, we we put together two of our drivers to see what would happen a couple of years ago. So we combined race and ethnicity with education. And you know, the results here were both surprising and disturbing. So we spent a couple of years on this work, and basically we found that and here we're only looking at blacks and whites with college degrees, okay? Just blacks and whites with college degrees. We found that blacks and Asians, whites and Asians with college degrees nearly doubled their wealth since between 1992 and 2013. Blacks and Hispanics with college degrees lost wealth between 1992 and 2013. So we said, how could this be? This is troubling, this is disturbing, what's going on behind this? This doesn't seem right. You were better off not having a college degree if you were black or Hispanic in terms of building wealth. So we put together a research symposium, we commissioned papers from leading scholars, we put out a report earlier in this year. You have an op-ed in the Washington Post that I wrote summarizing our results. But, you know, basically what's happening is that you have to look at what's going on with their wealth beyond the college degree, behind the college degree. Turns out that having student loans had a huge negative disproportionate effect on building wealth among black college graduates. Black college graduates were more likely to be homeowners, but homeownership wasn't such a great experience for them either, so that contributed to their wealth going down. Also, it turns out family transfers. Do you receive money from your parents or grandparents? Whites receive quite a bit. Blacks actually, when they have wealth, share it with extended family and friends. That's the norm. And so, you know, these and other factors, especially kind of early childhood experiences that magnify into earnings and wealth differentials later in life, contribute to this large gap. So please see the op-ed and if you want to learn a little bit more about that. But here's the final disturbing thing about this finding. We have this idea that education is a great equalizer, and it's not. In fact, what college is doing is actually widening the wealth gap, not closing it. Now, this does not mean that we don't support education. As I said before, for kids who are capable and willing, we should do everything we can to help them build skills and education over their lifetimes. But to think that education is going to close the gap is wrong. And one of the reasons that's wrong is because you have to look at college attainment rates. So a generation ago, there was a 12% gap between white and black college attainment rates, okay? It was 12% higher for whites than blacks. Today, that gap is 24%, okay? 24%. So that means that more whites are going to college than blacks as a proportion, but because whites earn more on their degrees than blacks, you know, the gap is just going to get bigger and bigger. So that's unfortunate. But I think it's important to frame our efforts not so much as closing racial wealth gaps or educational gaps, you know, but what can we do to build up folks on the bottom who deserve an education, who want an education, or who want an opportunity. We have to think about it more from a financial capability, asset building perspective, as opposed to our job is to close the gap, because I think it's going to be really hard to do that. So final finding, and then I'll close with a couple of thoughts about moving forward. Third finding is that liquidity and diversification matter for financial stability and building wealth. So in our own research, I have three things I want to mention about this. In our own research, when we studied which balance sheets were successful and which ones weren't, we found that there were three defining characteristics of strugglers, of the balance sheets of struggling families. One, they had too much wealth concentrated in home ownership, too much debt, and not enough savings and liquidity. Those were the three features. And so diversification, which is something you expect to hear at a wealth seminar, is actually the right idea for low-income families too. So we have to think about how do you help lower-income families diversify their balance sheets as well. And I think starting with liquidity and savings is really probably the right thing to do. Another stat, when a negative family event occurs, asset-poor families have 2 to 3 times more, they're more likely to experience material hardship than in non-asset poor families. Again, this cushion idea is really important. And then this final finding just came out a few weeks ago from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It was really one of the most powerful findings in this long study they did, this survey of economic well-being, financial well-being, over 6,000 families. They found that of all factors examined, disparities in financial well-being are greatest between subgroups that have different levels of liquid savings. It was the most powerful predictor of which families were doing well economically and felt secure versus ones that were not. So again, it was really powerful. So let me just, a few thoughts on what I think this means for moving forward. Let me just go back for a second, I'm sorry. So I think, many of you saw that the new payday loan rules were released by the CFPB. I think that's good and bad. It's bad because, are there enough alternatives out there for families who have real liquidity needs to meet them? Can we clone, Prepare and Prosper and other groups like that, to help, and banks and credit unions to fill those liquidity needs. So I'm a little concerned about that. And also, some of you might have read Lisa Servan's book, there are actually good rational reasons why low-income families use payday lenders and check cashers. It's not all evil. And so there is, these rules I think should be applauded overall, but, there are some concerns in the shorter term about how are those needs going to be met constructively for struggling families. Okay, so let me close with a few thoughts. Clearly, there's a lot to do. I can't even begin to talk about all the great opportunities around credit counseling and credit scores and budgeting, financial coaching that employers can do. I'm a huge fan of ESOPs, and I'm thrilled that Natasha is going to be talking about those on the next panel. But from our own research, I think there's a few things that I think are relevant to employee financial wellness going forward. First is, and maybe this is so obvious I don't need to say it, but to the extent possible, try to get out a family's balance sheet through counseling, through whatever it might be. You don't have ready access to that, but you really need it. I hope I've impressed upon you that without understanding a family's wealth, you really can't get underneath what's underlying the financial stability instability that you can see. So try to get that information in whatever responsible and thorough way you can. Secondly, when you are targeting your resources, I would think about student loan assistance for younger workers and parents of college students. So I mentioned that student loans have a negative and disproportionate effect on wealth. A study by Pew found that if you look at identical families, both college educated, one with student loans on their balance sheet, the other without, the one without has 6 to 7 times more net worth than the one with the loans. And that's controlling for everything. It's because student loans displace the ability to accumulate other kinds of wealth, getting married, buying a home, saving for retirement. So it really has a huge effect. So think about student loan assistance for younger workers and the parents who might be paying for those loans or for their kids' education. Secondly, this is important. Do not assume that your minority employees with high incomes and college or advanced degrees are not struggling financially. I hope that by looking at some of the numbers I shared with you on race and education, that even families with high incomes and high advanced degrees might really be struggling financially. Their wealth is likely to be 10% that of whites. They might be supporting an extended family. They're more likely to have student loan balances. There's a whole range of things going on. So you really have to look beyond degrees and beyond income to understand what's going on. And again, the importance of trying to look at wealth. And then finally, consider developing lifelong learning. I mean, the skills premium is just so clear. I think the correlations are so strong between education, having an education and building wealth. Of course, it works the other way as well. When you have wealth, you can build skills and education. So I think you want to get to the point where you get into this virtuous circle where you're promoting both. And I would urge you to think about lifelong learning and skills development, and maybe even think about using your state's 529 platform to do that. And I'm happy to talk about that later with any of you, but there's huge untapped potential with the 529 platform for this idea. The skills upgrading is critical. I'm reading Tom Friedman's new book, Thank You for Being Late. It's a wonderful synthesis of the data and the innovations going on right now around skills and companies that are trying to keep up with change and the importance of lifelong. Final implication, I think addressing the short-term liquidity needs of families is probably the single most important thing you can do for your employees. And there's a lot of innovations going on there around emergency savings, something that Jeremy is actually an expert on, something called sidecar emergency savings attached to a retirement account, automatic savings coming out of payroll, from somebody's pay into an emergency savings account. I think the work that Prepare and Prosper does around tax time savings is critical. It's a great opportunity. You can do more around that. But I think the data is pretty clear. You know, there's apps called Digit and Even. David Mitchell at Aspen wrote a great paper on emergency savings I would encourage you to look at. But anyway, it's probably the single most important intervention. Now, if we were talking about things outside of the workplace, I'd also encourage you to invest in child savings accounts or child development accounts as a way to start this whole wealth building process earlier in life. That's another talk. I'd love to give it. You know, bring me back. I'll tell you all about that. Dick Todd has some concerns about that. I'd love to have a discussion with Dick about that. But anyway, I think it's a great strategy for expanding opportunity and building skills. Okay, moving forward. Very briefly here, I think, you know, you all are familiar now with behavioral economics. I'm sure you saw that Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize in economics a few days ago. I put his picture there just because of that. And he really, you know, made this field possible, and it's remarkable the effects it's having. You can't do enough with this. And I've put pictures of some of the books that I have enjoyed most in this field, that I think they're all really important. I could have put 10 more, but these are the ones that I've really liked. I think, you know, the important thing here, you know, is we have intentions and we have behavior. Behavioral economics is closing the gap, right? We're terrible at acting in our own self-interest, even economically. So behavioral economics closes the gap, and the way it does that is it changes the context, right? It changes the context. So, you know, people around you, default settings, you know, social pressure, a whole range of things actually get you to change your behavior and put it in line with your own intentions. And I think the key thing I want to say here is that, you know, you have to ask who's behaving. And the focus of the field has always been try to get poor people or low-income people to behave better so they build more wealth. Well, it turns out that the vast majority of wealth in this country is not built because people save and build wealth. They make a decision to go do that. It's because an institution structures that savings and wealth building opportunity for them. Whether it's a tax return or it's you know, it's an employer or a GI Bill. You know, most wealth accumulation in this country occurs because an institution helped make it possible. They've structured that opportunity. So rather than, or in addition to thinking about, is this employee behaving right, is the institution behaving right? It's wealth accumulation has more to do with institutions behaving correctly than it does about individuals behaving correctly. Okay, individuals respond to the context that they're in. So employers, I think it's obvious, are among the key institutions for building wealth, and for that reason, I think you all have a great opportunity to do that for your employees. Thank you very much. Time?
Thanks. Thank you, Ray. We have about 10 minutes for questions before we'll take a break. So if you have any questions, my colleague in crime here, Amy Brennigan, is across the other room. So please just raise your hands and we'll bring you a microphone.
So So I have two questions. One, and I don't know if I have your quote right, but you said folks born in the Great Depression time have had greater financial success. Are you seeing that trending for those that were born in the 2008, 2010 financial crisis?
We don't know that yet. We don't have data that shows them as adults yet. Yeah, I wish we had data on that, but we don't know that yet. It may well be true if, in fact, there were fewer births because of the recession. That might, in fact, be true. But there were so many other things going on because of that we don't know. But the basic idea, yeah, smaller cohorts tend to be better, but there's a lot of other factors as well.
Okay, my second question is, as an employer, we'd like to be able to do more to target, student loan repayment, short-term financial emergency. We do 401ks and hardships and things like that. But my question is, do you know kind of the dollar amount that is the right, that will be able to hit the mark? And so as an employer, when we're budgeting for things like this and we want to implement programs and policies, I'm kind of wondering, is it $500? Is it $5,000? Like, where is that threshold where it is going to make an impact and make a difference?
So maybe Jeremy would want to weigh in on this as well. The numbers that I've seen as policy recommendations range from about 200 to about maybe 3,000 is kind of the sweet spot that is impactful, but also affordable, I think, from an intervention standpoint. I think that's kind of the number you want to look at. There's data showing that if you have access to $500, you're eight times less likely to go to a payday lender. But then there's other studies showing that $2,000 really can make a huge difference for families. One way to get at that is to look at how much is borrowed at payday lenders and see if you can substitute for that. Any other numbers come to mind for you, Jeremy, on that?
No, Ray, I think that's, I think we don't know is the short answer, right, as you said. I think there's a good sense of where the sort of problem levels are, whether it's $500 or $2,000. There's some interesting experiments going on. I won't give a presentation on sidecar savings, I promise. But when I get the stage later. There's some pilot experiments going on in the UK that hopefully may happen here in the US that look at if you were to establish that sort of emergency savings fund, right? That's really one of the key questions. What's the right level, right? Is it 500? Is it 1,000? What kinds of things sort of count as an emergency? I think we have a lot to learn. Not a helpful answer, I know.
If you start with $2,000, I think you're going to be. That's a great place to start if you can afford that.
I had a question about some of the data collection and where you're putting it in some of your figures. Some elements affect some age groups more than others. For example, when they're involved in court cases, especially when the attorneys are battling it out and waiting until all the assets are gone before quitting. When there's major medical expenses, other adverse events, when they're victims of disaster, scams, or with the elderly, dementia?
So are you wondering if the data are capturing some of those things? So the question, the data that the Fed has put out and others have put out, ask families, when you face a financial crisis or you're short on cash, you have a something unanticipated happens. Are you able to come up with $400 in one study, and about half of Americans said they could not. Another study said, could you come up with $2,000? And again, about half families could not over 30 days. It includes anything that puts a strain on a family. And whether or not they can leverage those resources. So I think, yes, and thankfully, there is more attention now to fines, fees, what the court system itself is doing to punish low-income families. If you haven't had a chance to look into it, the San Francisco mayor's office started an Office of Financial Justice, where they're kind of taking an asset-building approach to fines and fees. So I would urge you to look at that. They're pulling together data and evidence about this, what they're calling financial justice, and it's looking specifically at that system. Hey, Eric.
Hi.
I'm wondering about Raj Chetty's research on mobility and whether that takes into account wealth building, or if there's a crosswalk going on with some of the mobility research that's really prominent right now.
So thanks for mentioning Chetty. Just so you all know, Stanford economist Raj Chetty did a seminal economic mobility study showing what's the likelihood of a kid born in the bottom 20% rising to the top 20% as an adult, an adult as in their 30s. He found a lot of things. One was that there was enormous variation by metropolitan region in those rates. Folks in San Jose were 3 times more likely to rise at the top than kids in St. Louis, for example. You know, it's a huge difference, 5% in St. Louis, 15% in San Jose. And he found that 5 things were correlated with who moves up and who doesn't. Wealth was not one of them. It's not something that he studied. What he did find is that the level of local inequality mattered, the level of segregation mattered, the quality of public schools, social capital, networks and relationships, and 5th, family structure. And the family structure finding was the most interesting because it was the most powerful. But secondly, it was interesting in that it didn't matter if a particular kid was a child of a single parent. It was the fraction of single parents in a neighborhood that determined. So if there was a large fraction of single parents, that was negatively associated with upward economic mobility. I would love to see future work focus on the relationship between wealth and mobility, but you know, Dalton Conley and others have looked at that, but not as systematically as Chetty did.
We have time for one more question, if anyone has a burning question.
And I'm here, guys, so ask me questions later on.
Hi, Tracey Fishman with Prepare and Prosper. Thank you for this really helpful presentation and really laying the groundwork for, I think, as we drill down into some very concrete solutions. Towards the end of your presentation, you talked about some institutional ways within employer settings where we could facilitate some change, recognizing that there are structural policy barriers as well as opportunities. So if you were going to say, I think that these are 2 very scalable opportunities for employers to think about maybe low lift and maybe medium level lift changes as we set the stage for our panel after our break. What would those be?
Well, I think I would say the medium level lift would be committing to lifelong learning for all your employees. Really funding that, taking it seriously, encouraging it, creating a culture around it. It's probably the most important thing you can do. The more immediate thing is work with folks like Prepare and Prosper, nonprofits, credit unions, others to create a pool of liquidity for your struggling employees. So, you know, there's a lot of great work, a lot of great research. Credit unions have been real pioneers in this. So and there's, as I mentioned, there's a lot of ways you can facilitate emergency savings, whether attached to a retirement account. You can set up an automatic payroll deposit into an account outside the workplace. So I would really rally behind just helping families get by. That CFPB finding was really powerful, I thought.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
For your presentation and responding to questions. If we could give Ray another round of applause. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you all.
At this point in time, we'll be taking a 15-minute break. So once again, we have refreshments out in the corridor over here. We'll see you back at 9:30. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm on. This is good. So I'd like to apologize in advance. I brought a frog with me. It's living here in my chest. So if I cough, I'm going to try and remember to cover my mic, so you're not all deafened by that. But welcome. I'm really excited about this panel. Thank you. I would note to the organizers that following Ray Bashara is always a really, really hard task, especially when he calls you an expert on a certain issue. You know, I have a lot to live up to now, it turns out. But thank you to Michael, to the staff here at the Federal Reserve in Minneapolis, to Tracey and the staff there. It's really exciting to be part of this event, and I'm honored to participate. So what I plan to do is talk briefly, right? Because I think to extend Ray's analogy about climate and weather, I think we're going to talk more about weather. And then when we get into the panel, because we're here in Minnesota, we're going to talk about what's going to happen today, this afternoon, that's going to affect weather in a very agricultural state, whether I can do some harvesting or some planting. Or, you know, this is like the reality on the ground of what it means to actually do this in practice, I think is really important. And I think one of the reasons it's really important is that, as I'll talk about in a minute, we don't know that much yet about what's working and why. And so having conversations like this it's essential to get a sense of the things that are being done on the ground, what's working, what's not working, why they're working, what are the upsides, what are the successes, what are the challenges. That is as important at this moment, given where we are in the field, as anything. And so we're going to be very much talking about weather. In my remarks, I will plan at one point to skip back up and talk about climate, because I think in addition to all the great information that Ray shared, we've done some work, others have done some work on income volatility that I think is worth pointing out and pointing you to some good work in that area, because it's really essential, as Ray was saying at the end, this note about liquid savings and having access to emergency liquidity is driven by a number of things, but one of them is income volatility. And so I want to spend just a little bit of time highlighting some work that my colleagues at Aspen have done in that area, and then we'll get back into employee wellness and what that means. Quick introduction of me. I'm Jeremy Smith. I'm the Associate Director of the Financial Security Program at the Aspen Institute. Within the Financial Security Program, I work on the Retirement Savings Initiative, which, like all of our programs at the Financial Security Program, we focus on building savings and wealth and dealing with financial challenges, mostly for low and moderate income families, right? How is it that we make the systems that we have that work really well for a certain percentage of the population? I like to say that it's a little bit like healthcare. We have systems that work really well for probably 10% of the population, maybe 15% of the population, then pretty well for about half of the population, but not so well at all for the other half. And at the Financial Security Program, we're very focused on how it is we take what works and extend it to those people who need it as much as everyone in this room. So let's see if I can make the clicker work here. So just a quick roadmap. Again, I'm not going to talk long. I also, instead of taking questions, I think we'll go right into the panel, and then any questions about, if there are any questions about my remarks, we can address it broader more broadly in the question and answer session that follows. But so I'm going to talk quickly about financial stress. Michael referred to that in his opening remarks. Ray, of course, talked in great detail about all of the things that are driving that financial stress. As I said, I'll make a note on our work on income volatility, our work and others. Talk briefly about sort of the growing interest in employee wellness, which of course is the reason we're here today. And then point to some promising practice and some relevant Aspen work that Ray already referred to, our work on sidecar savings and also our work on hybrid financial products. And so, look at that. employee financial stress, right? So there are a lot of good surveys, right, from the American Psychology Association, from Price Waterhouse, from Aon Hewitt, that are that show that employee stress, financial stress in the workplace is this growing problem. Michael alluded to this in his remarks, right? As it says there, I won't read the slide, right? But this is lots and large percentages of the workforce report financial stress as one of their most important causes of stress while they're in the workplace. And not surprisingly, right, it affects performance. This stat is pretty amazing, right? 1 in 5 employees admitted that they had skipped work to deal with a financial problem. So it's having an impact, right, on productivity. It's having an impact on absenteeism. It's having an impact on turnover. And so as a result, of course, employers are keenly aware that this is an issue that they need to deal with. Now this is where we skip to back into climate, because I think it's worth noting, this is sort of building on what Ray said. One of the reasons that financial stress, certainly not the only reason, but I think one of the ones that we're just starting to learn about more is how much income volatility a typical employee faces. So I'll talk in a second about this stat. There's work that my colleagues at Aspen, Joanna Smith-Romani and the team who work on something called EPIC, the Expanding Prosperity Impact Collaborative, which is a real mouthful, by the way, when you have a cold. EPIC is this really amazing new initiative that looks deeply over the course of 18 months to 2 years at one single emerging issue to try and get a better handle on what it is, why it matters, what we can possibly do about it. And so our work, the work of the JP Morgan Institute, which has done some really fascinating stuff around looking at the actual data, not survey data, but actual data of their clients' spending patterns and savings patterns to sort of tease out how they're doing, which has just been incredibly illuminating. And also the slide here you'll see comes from a great study called the Financial Diaries, which was done by Rachel Schneider and Jonathan Murdoch, that looked at a group of about 250 families over the course of a year, checking in on them basically on a daily basis to map out what was going on, what they were spending, what they were saving, what they were doing. And what they learned, they did not go into the study thinking that this was what they were going to learn, but what they learned is that income volatility was a huge issue, and that prior to that, I think there was a growing awareness that income volatility was a problem, but the data that we had to measure it was year to year, right? 1 year you're doing well, 1 year you're doing not so well. What this showed is that within the year, within the month, sometimes within the week, people's incomes spike and dip. And so what this shows you is that this is over the course of a year. This is a family's average monthly income. And what you can see there is that 2.5 months out of the year, income is more than 25% higher than the average. 2.5 times a year, income is lower. So when you think about people's ability to plan, to cover their expenses, to meet their financial needs, the sort of traditional notion that we all have steady paychecks and all you need to do is plan, this data really calls into question whether that model really makes much sense. And so I think it's really important as we think about employee wellness and financial well-being more broadly to think about the reality of what many of our workers are actually going through. I would also note here that referring to that JP Morgan research, right, they found, even though we're talking about very different groups of people, right, the Financial Diaries was, again, about 250 families, mostly low and moderate income. JP Morgan's client base, while is broad and diverse, but generally it tends to skew more upper income. They found that amazingly, 55% of their customers regularly experience more than a 30% change in income month to month. So this is not just a problem experienced by lower middle class people. This is a mainstream problem. The other thing they found, I think, which is really relevant for our conversation later, is that according to their estimates, a family would need, and this gets in a different way to the question you asked earlier, right? Which is, how much would you need? What JP Morgan estimated was $4,800 was the amount of liquid savings that people would need to smooth what they were seeing in the variation. Again, with a probably wealthier client base. However, what they found was that people on average had $3,000. So there was an almost $2,000 gap that people did not have access to, and the only people who had access to that were upper income. So when we think about why this matters and how this is important and how this relates to financial well-being and employee wellness, thinking of families who are basically rowing in a leaky boat as they go forward means that the amount of stress that they're under, that we talked about earlier, is very much a function of their ability to cope with their short-term needs, right? It's very hard to plan for the future, right? If you can't manage your, if the short-term is an ever-present worry. So, back to weather. So, excuse me. There's as I mentioned earlier, that Aon Hewitt and others have done a lot of interesting surveys about interest in employee wellness. And one of the things that I think is really worth noting here is, again, the data is relatively sparse, right? What that survey showed is that 3 out of 4 were interested and likely or somewhat likely to expand programs that would deal with financial well-being. However, we don't know what a program is, and we don't know whether they actually did any of those things. But what we do know is that there's a fair bit of interest in doing more, right? And there's also a lot of really interesting work that's starting to get done to measure this phenomenon, right? You have a great new report from the CFPB on well, it's not new, it's I guess 2015, on financial wellness at work that outlines some really promising practice that we can talk about more. There was just a great conference put on in Ray's hometown of St. Louis by the Center for Social Development that also is really beginning to map out what we know and what we don't know about who's doing what and what's working and why. One of the things that research notes, right, is that we don't have a common definition yet of what constitutes a financial wellness program. And I think what we'll see in the panel, right, is that individual firms are doing very different things. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing, right? But as we begin to understand what works and why, right, that's the key ingredient to take skeptical employers and take them from, I think I should do this, to I really should do this, and here's what I might want to do, and this is how it's going to either, it's going to improve my bottom line. Is it going to improve my bottom line because I'm more effectively targeting my HR dollars in the right places? Is it going to improve my bottom line because I have reduced turnover? What are the ways in which this works? That's an area we really need to understand, right? And I think, as someone who spends a lot of time talking to employers who think about retirement, right? Retirement benefits are very expensive, like healthcare benefits. And so when you're thinking about adding on additional wellness programs, I think the first question is, where does that get paid for, right? And I think we're at this place where most of what's getting done, actually, let me skip ahead here, right? Most of what's getting done is, appears to be education and help with planning, right? And that's important work that we'll hear about more in a second. But it's also relatively inexpensive. And when you think about, especially compared to the cost of retirement benefits and healthcare benefits, right? But when you think about what workers may need, right? Access to liquid savings, that gets you into a need for programs that might actually cost something. So where the cost savings come from and how it fits in or perhaps maps onto already existing programs, say like retirement benefits, I think are going to be really essential. And so this work from the CFPB and the work, the Center for Social Development, have pointed out that there are a lot of really interesting intersections here. And one of them, I think, and this is key, it'll come out in our conversation in a minute, right, is that things seem to work if employees are in a place where they trust their employer, then providing this kind of information can be incredibly effective. Obviously, if it's done well, it enhances that, right? So doing it in a way that enhances that trust is incredibly important, right? I think there's also some really interesting work, as we'll see from Commonwealth and others, that figuring out ways to do this with partners who are active in the community can be a great way to reduce the costs and improve the effectiveness of the programs. I think a third one is that, as it says here, right, is picking up on what Ray was saying about what we've learned from the field of behavioral economics and from Richard Thaler and others, right, is tying the information to specific action, right? And we're going to hear more about that in the panel as well, right? Is somebody getting a raise? Is there a moment where you have to make a certain financial decision, right? When is it that you offer this information, and how many times you offer the information is incredibly important. But again, as I said earlier, like one of the key points is going to be that we need more data to help show what works and why. And then I'll end with a brief infomercial that sort of taps into the work that we're doing in this area. So my colleague David Mitchell did a great study on sidecar savings, an issue brief. We've also done some work on hybrid financial products, of which sidecar savings is an example, right? And so hybrid financial products, right, are tools that, which are happening with some of the applications that Ray talked about earlier, Even and Digit, places where they're, helping people plan while they spend, or save while they spend, or budget while they save, or save for both short-term needs and long-term needs, or manage their debt, right? These are increasingly, there are these exciting opportunities where you create products that serve more than one need at a time in reflection of the reality that employees and families have a multiplicity of financial needs, and our sort of piped approach is increasingly not meeting people where they are, right? So I would encourage you to take a look at the hybrid piece. I'll say a little bit more about Sidecar because that came from my side of the house, which is there's some really interesting pilots that are getting put together that basically try to take what works, again, getting back to the cost, what works with, say, retirement plans, right? And what we know, as Ray said, and I think you couldn't really emphasize this point enough, that institutional structures are what drives people's savings. Right? That isn't to say that people don't have personal responsibility, that your choices don't matter, because of course they do. But what we know about what effectively drives savings, right, is people build wealth in their homes by paying their mortgage payment. That creates savings, that creates equity, but it is not actually an act of savings, right? But it results in savings. Retirement benefits, when they work best, per Richard Thaler and others' work, you go into an employer, they have an opt-out plan rather than an opt-in plan. That drives participation rates way, way up. They set a default at a higher level, you save more money. You can choose not to do those things, but if you nudge people in the right direction, people will save more, right? And the idea of sidecar savings is to take advantage of that. Take advantage of payroll deduction and the simplicity of that. Take advantage of automatic enrollment. Take advantage of all the pieces that we know in retirement work and see if we can apply those lessons to a different kind of financial product. And the model is still getting tested, how it would actually work. But the idea would be you would have a parallel account, and there's all kinds of regulatory constraints about what that account might look like. But essentially, money would go in, you would fill it up to a certain level, and then money would flow into the longer term account. And the question I think we're trying to answer is, does that payroll deduction and the ability to sort of set it and forget it actually help people manage their short-term needs as well? We're really excited about this work. We think it could have a real impact on people's well-being. But as I said, it's early days. But so with that, I'm going to move to the panel. So thank you. Feels a bit like I've gone behind screen and now I'm back. So you guys have people's bios, so I'm not going to do lengthy descriptions of everybody, but I'm delighted to be on this panel. So on my immediate left is Chad Dunkley, who's the Chief Executive Officer of New Horizons Academy. Next to him is Natasha Nodsley, who's the Director of Human Resources at SJE Rhombus, which is a local manufacturing firm that deals with wastewater and other related issues here in Minnesota. And then last but certainly not least is Melissa Gopnik, who's Senior Vice President at Commonwealth, which does a lot of really amazing work in the asset field more broadly and is doing some really interesting work on financial wellness. So please join me in welcoming them. And we're really excited for a great panel. So what I'd like to do is ask people to give sort of brief opening remarks to just kind of lay the context, right? Who are you? What's your firm? What are you guys doing in financial wellness? And what got you interested in doing that work in the first place? So I'll start with you, Chad.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. I'm Chad Dunkley from New Horizon Academy. I would say the reason I'm really interested in this, I think many of you have heard in early childhood now, we recognize 90% of brain development happens before age 5. In fact, my teachers might be and are the most important teachers in a child's lifetime. And if they carry financial stress and bring that into the classroom, it affects the children. And it also affects turnover. One of the things that's very clear in our field, it's human relationships, the teacher-child interactions that are most critical to a child's development, and losing a teacher to a child is a huge loss, in a way almost like a death. And so one of the challenges in our field is low resources. Parents can't afford the cost of high quality, but we have such low teacher-child ratios, kids are with us such big parts of the day, that wages cannot be as high as they absolutely should be. So we have some of those struggles. Let me just give you statistics. I'm fortunate we work in an organization in a state where wages are much higher in early childhood here in Minnesota than they are nationally. I think I saw a national statistic that wages are about $11 an hour. That's closest to our starting wages of aides here in Minnesota. Our average center wage is $17.20, which is still not enough, but that's a wage for many staff who we want to have college degrees. More and more expectations are growing. Much of our staff are young. It's 95% female. Our staff are more diverse than the Minnesota population. Non-white is, last time I looked, 35%, something like that. And Kelly Black, our Director of Benefits back here, has done an amazing job. So we have a pretty young staff who are low in the compensation scale, and yet we want to talk to them about savings, financial retirement, wellness. That's not easy to do. I mean, we hit almost every box that came out this morning from Ray's talk about our demographics. And the challenge of doing that. And I think what we've learned over the last 5 years, we created something called Well Connect. And it has pieces, a quarterly reminder of different things like savings, 401k, other benefits that are available. But we really weren't getting enough participation, so we've created more tailored information to employees, and now we do monthly emails. As a matter of fact, we're just ending a 6-month financial education plan. July, the subject was budgeting, so we sent in information on that. August was savings. The third was investments in September. 401k is October. And then in November and December, it's how much to contribute to your 401k and support tools for investments. The good news is we have We're nearing 300 on our 401k, which is a huge improvement over the last 5 years, sad to say, because that's still a very small percentage. But in the last month, I think the last few weeks, we've had more than a dozen new staff add on to our 401k. So making it more specific. Another thing is customizing to the reality of your workforce. One of the first savings tools I saw was saying put 20% away in savings. I don't think that's realistic for many of our staff. So let's get realistic and say, look, even if it's $20 a week to start with, but give realistic calculators. We also have something online to show kind of what savings can do for you, what your 401 plan can do for you. And our group Heartland we work with is going to start going to staff meetings as well and try to more practically talk to the realities of what our staff make and what they should be doing at their stage of employment for savings and financial security.
Thanks, Chad.
Yeah.
So I'm Natasha Nodsley with SJ Rhombus. Our headquarters is in Detroit Lakes. Has any of you ever heard of SJ Rhombus? Is it because your sump pump alarm went off? Because not a lot of people know what we do, but it's exciting to share. So we have 7 locations in the U.S. We have 3 in the state of Minnesota, 2 in Ohio, Florida, California, and we also have about 60 employees in Suzhou, China. And so we manufacture liquid level controls and alarms for the water, wastewater industry. It's what we do. So we manufacture, we do designing, we do engineering. And like I said, our headquarters is in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. So that's the largest location. We have about 200 employees coming and going every day. We have a total population of about over 400 employees domestically. So I'm just going to run through a few stats because I think it's interesting is 25% of our team is millennials, and that number is continuing to grow. We have 37% Gen Xers, and I'm in that group, 38% baby boomers, and we have an age span of our workplace. Our youngest worker is 19 and our oldest worker is 74. And so we're trying to manage the financial well-being of that entire sector. We have, I would say, probably 200 production type assembly roles. They're non-exempt roles. It was interesting, your average salary you said was $17.20, we're at $17.50, so we're right there. So some are gonna be lower and some are gonna be higher, but that's kind of what we're dealing with, and that's the population that we probably get the most comments on that they struggle financially is in that those kind of ranges. So what do we do? I'm going to kind of go through a few of the things that we do that is probably other organizations are doing as well, and then I'll talk to you about what I think our biggest benefit is, and that's our ESOP. And so some of the things that we do outside of our ESOP, because that's kind of a beast in its own, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, is we have a holiday fund program, which is we allow employees to just save money. Set aside of money starting January 1. It goes into a non-interest bearing account, and we pay it out to them right before Black Friday, really. We pay it out to them right in November. Some of the guys like it because they use it for hunting, and the girls like it because they use it to go shopping. But it's their own money, but it's just an account that they set aside, and it's very easy for us to administer, and it's pretty, it's not very costly. We also have an employee assistance program that provides a lot of robust financial counseling. We've offered Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace in the Workplace. Have any of you heard of the Financial Peace program? If you not a lot of hands, I would say look at it. It was really fantastic. It was originally centered for churches, and then he created a program that you can bring into the workplace, and it was really excellent material. We have a high deductible health plan, and so employees need to reach their deductible before the insurance kicks in. The one thing that we've done interesting with that is we've made it 100% co-insurance. So employees know what their worst case scenario is, and that's just the amount of their deductible. So they can mentally plan for that, and they can contribute money to their health savings account to fund their deductible. So they're not guessing about, I have a deductible, and then I have a copayment, and then I have co-insurance at X percentage and out-of-pocket max. The out-of-pocket max and the deductible is equal. We also have a 401k, and we do automatic enrollment upon the day you are hired. So in addition to filling out your I-9 on your first day, you're also filling out, or actually not filling out, your 401k form because it's automatic. We're telling them if you don't want to participate, then you need to sign a form. Otherwise, we are going to enroll you, and we are going to enroll you at 6% of your income so you can get the full company match of 1.5%. 1.5% might seem small, but we contribute 15% of employees' gross income into our ESOP. We also provide company-paid life insurance, so they and their families don't have to worry about that if something should happen. We also offer tuition reimbursement. We offer a scholarship program for employees' children and grandchildren and spouses, and we do allow the opportunity for employees to deposit into multiple accounts for their paycheck, again, making that savings automatic. Again, it's their own accounts, but we do allow for multiple accounts so they can direct, well, I want the net of my check to go here, and I want $20 a paycheck to go here. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the ESOP. Have any of you ever worked for an employee-owned company? No one? Okay, that actually doesn't surprise me. Figured maybe one of you would, but that's one of the challenges is a lot of employees joining our team have never worked for an employee-owned company and they don't know what an ESOP is. So what an ESOP is simply it's a retirement fund. It's a retirement fund that is set up by the company. Our founder, Steve Johnston, established our ESOP in 1987. This month, we are celebrating 30 years of employee ownership, which is absolutely awesome. We became 100% employee owned in 1998. So when an employee joins our team, the date of hire, the hour they step into our building, they become an employee owner and they're vested in the success of our company. In May, SJ Rhombus was recognized as the national employee-owned company in the U.S., and we're excited about that. There are about 7,000 to 8,000 ESOP companies in the U.S., covering about 13 million employees. The largest ESOP is Publix grocery store, if you've heard of them, down in Florida, in the South. And I would say about 4,000 ESOPs are 100% employee owned. So some of the larger ones here in Minnesota would be Life Touch, Wallman Optical Group is employee owned, and Plastic Products and so on. So one of the questions that we were asked is, why did we establish an ESOP? And I just have a quote from our founder, Steve Johnson, which I think sums it up really well. He stated before he left and retired, he said, the reason I realized employees were my company's greatest assets, and I learned to attract and surround myself with the very best people. I delegated and assigned responsibility to them. I put trust in them. As I considered the future of SJ Rhombus, I realized that the employees were making the company successful, and I felt the employees should share in the company's success and ownership. And that's why he created the ESOP. So the ESOP is structured in that our company will give employees 15% of their gross income in shares of stock a year. That's money that's given to them. They don't have to contribute to it, and it's held in a trust. And what we want to see is those accounts going up every year, and they go up in two ways. You get your contribution each year, which is 15% of your gross income. And so as your gross income goes up, your contribution will go up as well. And then we hope our share price continues to rise, because then the balance of your account grow because all the shares go up at that new level. Over the last 5 years, our share price has increased on an average of 20% a year, which is outpacing anything that you're going to see from our competitors or the stock market. What's also exciting is we have set an internal goal to have our share price reach a specific dollar amount by the year 2020. So we're 2 years away. It's gone very quickly. When that happens, out of our 378 domestic employees, 44 of them will be millionaires. They will have over $1 million in their ESOP accounts. And these are employees, a lot of them are your hourly workers who have stayed with the company and are going on 10, 15, 20, 25 years of experience. That's exciting for us because living in a small town, Detroit Lakes is a small town, population 7,000, we don't even have a Target. What those millionaires will be able to do for our communities and the communities that they live in and their families and their children and the education that they can provide and the vacations that they can take and the retirements that they can have because of our ESOP is really what motivates us to keep the ESOP strong and to keep growing as a company.
Thanks, Natasha.
Really, really exciting. Melissa,
Yeah, I'm not sure I can follow that.
Yeah, I
I'm
know,
not making
I
anyone a
know.
millionaire. So.
you guys going to go start an ESOP, I hope?
I'm sitting here in awe. So good morning, everyone. I'm here representing Commonwealth, and we are a nonprofit organization, a national nonprofit with headquartered in Boston. So I'm happy to be on this side of the country today. And we are basically an innovation lab. So what we do is we collaborate with people from the private sector, from the social sector, from the government sector, to come up with new, innovative, and practical solutions to make people financially secure. So we are concerned with that, the 50% who are not financially secure that we talked about earlier. And so it's not only about income, but it's about assets, as Ray talked a lot about, that someone is financially vulnerable, not only because they're perhaps low or moderate income, but also because of their assets, their debt, their financial capability. So what we have been doing for the last year is listening. That's how we always start our projects, is listening to the people who are living the lives of the financially vulnerable. So we've been listening to workers, to employers, to HR folks, to advocates, to all sorts of people to understand what are the biggest financial challenges and what are the biggest opportunities for financial security in the workplace. And we've kind of honed in on two very kind of specific, practical things that we think can radically change the financial security of workers in the workplace. The first is raises. So there's been lots of stuff in the news about lots of large companies increasing their low-wage income wages, Walmart, Target, locally, JP Morgan Chase. There's also a whole movement around minimum wage increases across the country. And as the labor market tightens, more and more people are getting raises. But what we have seen is that no one is kind of thinking about that as a huge opportunity to start to build financial security for these workers, right? So when we talk to employers about, well, how are you making sure that this raise of $1 an hour, $1.50 an hour is going to really set them on the path to financial security and then set them on the path to financial opportunity, people aren't thinking about it in those terms. So we think there's a huge opportunity to change what people are doing about the raises. And we did some pilots in San Francisco, which I can talk about changing the communication and the infrastructure around raises to really make that opportunity a reality for workers. The other big thing we heard in our listening tour was about out-of-pocket health expenses and how that is drastically impacting, especially lower wage workers, but all workers. It's leading to financial stress, it's leading to delayed or forgone medical care, increase in debt, and just in general increase to financial stress for many, many people. And a lot of that is due to high deductible health plans and the growth of those plans through the employer. I'm thrilled to hear what Natasha's company has done around providing kind of a co-insurance and making sure people understand what high deductible health plans are. How many people here actually understand what their deductible is? That's pretty impressive. When we did a survey of people with high deductible health plans and said, describe to us in your own words what a deductible is or what your dollar amount of your deductible. You know, vast majority couldn't describe it in their own words. Well, something to do with if I go to the doctor, if I'm sick, but really there's a huge amount of education required around that. And so we think, but we've seen examples like Natasha and other companies who've done an amazing job designing high deductible health plans and implementing them in a way that promotes financial security, that mitigates the risks of these plans. And we think that's easy for any employer to do, is to offer those plans in a way that will build their financial security and not contribute to financial insecurity. And so we have all sorts of ideas around wanting to pilot these new ways of thinking about that. And we really believe that, in fact, to build financial security and wellness, you don't necessarily have to add new programs and new costs. If you do what you're doing today, but in a different way, thinking about it differently, you'll be amazed, I think, about how much impact you can have with your employees. And I can talk more about that later.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. So we have a sense now of what you guys are doing and some really amazing success stories from Natasha. But I'd like to hear from Chad. Say a little bit more about both what's working, what you're learning, and do you have a sense yet of how it's impacting the sort of bottom line of the organization, either from a single bottom line perspective or a broader bottom line perspective?
Well, as I said, I think turnover is costly. We all know that. Training in staff, replacing staff, and like I said, we take it even more personally because of the relationship with children. And so if we can find benefits that help our employees stabilize their financial security, I think of health insurance. We've made some adjustments to our health insurance program. So now we're moving to a new plan. We're self-insuring to reduce the fees we have. We've had a good experience this last year because we have relatively healthy employees. They're pretty busy with little kids all day, so they stay active and healthy for the most part. But we're going back to you pay $35 to go see a doctor. We don't want our employees who maybe got sick from one of the children in their classroom to end up with a $200 copay because they went to visit a doctor to get some antibiotics. So there's things like that we're trying to do as we're looking closely at our staff experiences. But I would say the thing as employers, and we're all going to have to figure this out, and this came up earlier, is really helping our teachers, our staff get their education. As the reality in the field, we have a very low unemployment rate in Minnesota. We bring in many staff at an aid level who are really good with kids. When we discover you have a talent, we help pay you to go back to school. And we do a substantial tuition reimbursement program. Actually, each year we fully scholarship 5 staff to go on to their BA. We pay every penny of that. In addition to that, we pay up to $5,000 for anyone to get their AA or BA, actually $6,500 for their master's. But what we do, because colleges are crazy expensive, to go into early childhood and make $17 an hour when you have $100,000 in student loans is crazy. I actually hate to see teachers come to us out of college with those kind of loans. It's going to be hard for them to financially make it unless their spouse can afford to support them. But we have programs and relationships with colleges where you can work during the day, you can do your schoolwork at night, self-paced, you get some credit for being in the classroom, and you can do this for $20,000 to get your BA, not $35,000 or $50,000 per year. And I think that's been one of our most effective. It's like on-the-job training and then selecting your best employees. As a matter of fact, I just announced yesterday all our schools were closed. To all of our employees, we're starting a new position called student teacher. So if we select you as an aide to go into one of these programs and we help you go back to school, we raise your pay during the time period that you're going back to school to make it more affordable for you. But it's really the reality of the field. The other thing that I'm fortunate about, but I think should come up, the young families are faced with huge childcare costs. The cost of high quality is so expensive for every family, no matter what your income level. And the reality is the fact that I can pay higher wages in the field, my infant rate full-time is $20,000 a year. So what family with 9 months to plan for the birth of an infant can afford $20,000 a year early in their income cycle? I don't know how we expect young families in this country to save money. That's not possible. And that we are often more expensive than housing. And it really is an investment in the future. When you look at the studies, it doesn't matter where your child comes from. They are better off in a high quality setting. And high quality settings cost money because wages is the big driver. And we got to pay our people better as we expect them to have a higher level of education. So I give discounts that are at least 50 up to 65 or 70% off to our teaching staff. So when our families with education degrees have young children, that's often the time we get them to fall in love with early childhood. And as their children come to our program and they graduate and go on to kindergarten, they're stuck because they love the children and they stay. So we're happy about that. And hopefully as they stay and their education level goes up, their wage goes up and they have other opportunities to move into leadership and other things. But we have to be creative as employers to really fill huge voids of lack of employees. I just heard recently there are more openings in Minnesota than there are jobs. I mean, there are more than jobs available. So I think we're all going to struggle with that in figuring out how to help our workforce. But this country has to figure out how to support young families. Young families with little kids should not struggle. They're the ones that are going to be paying for all of us to retire soon, and yet they're faced with some of the biggest problems. We need to use tax strategy. We need to use things like early learning scholarships that this Federal Reserve Bank helped make happen here in Minnesota for lower income families. But it's a real struggle everywhere.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Chad. And I would just say, so in my spare time, I'm on the board of a private child development center in Washington, D.C., right? And I've been on it, I've been involved for many years. And, you know, for a while I was the chair, and I developed this rap for new board members to explain the budget to them. And basically it was, here's the only number you need to know, 90%. 90% of what we take in comes in what the families pay, because we're a small organization that doesn't have an endowment. 90% that goes out is salaries and benefits for the staff. So if you want to raise the one, you need to raise the other, full stop. So this is the challenge of that problem, right? It is a very labor intensive and service, and it's one where quality is essential, right? One of the most important things. And so you guys are doing amazing work, and the focus on education is incredible. And I would also just note what I was hearing when you were talking, which was so exciting, is really having an understanding of your particular workforce and what they need and what their challenges are. I think is one of the themes that's going to be woven throughout the conversation, right? That what makes these programs work is having a great sense of what could help your particular group of employees. So thank you. So Natasha, you've already talked about really exciting stuff around the ESOP, but say more about other ways that you guys are measuring success. I mean, it'd be difficult to imagine a better success metric than the number of millionaires from the ESOP.
Yeah.
So I think the headline might be gone for this part of your remarks, but you guys are doing so much, and you know, I'm by no means an expert in financial wellness, but broadly speaking, like, you guys check so many of the boxes. Talk a little bit more about how, when you guys think about this as a success, what do you measure, and how do you know whether what you're doing is working?
Well, engagement and turnover is, you know, two things that we're measuring outside of the performance of our stock, right? So we actually do biannual, so twice a year we do engagement surveys, and our engagement surveys is very similar to what you've seen from the Gallup poll, if you've read the book, First Break All the Rules. And so we're measuring engagement because we want our teams to be engaged. Of course, there's lots of studies that show a more engaged worker is happier, they produce more results than someone who's not engaged. And then we also look at turnover, and we're looking at, you know, now it's like, when are we having the turnover and what are we seeing? And what we've realized over the last couple of years is we're seeing turnover typically between 6 months and 6 years. If they're going to turn over, that's our highest risk. And then after 6 years, it's almost like they'll stay to retirement. And I think that's because you become 100% vested in the ESOP at 6 years. So we are now focusing on a robust onboarding program, and we're trying to figure out what we can do to keep our employees engaged in years 2, 3, 4, 5, where their stock accounts aren't, you know, super high yet. It's starting to make sense, but they're not fully vested, and it's still not enough to maybe not have them be intrigued by another employer who might be offering them 50 cents more an hour. And so we're really measuring turnover, and we're really measuring engagement. And those engagement surveys are broke out by supervisor groups. So we get an aggregate score on our entire company and how we're doing, and then we're breaking it out by supervisor so we can see, you know, what is the leadership doing and how does the leadership impact engagement.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. So Melissa, it'd be great if you could dive down a little bit into the pilots and begin to tease out what you guys are learning.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really exciting work too.
So I want to pick up on something Jeremy said about the importance of actually listening to workers and their specific needs. So one of the things we did was a kind of national survey of lower wage workers, because those are the workers we care about, and we think they may have different needs than some of what the kind of broader surveys look at. And to pick up on something Ray had said, you know, almost half said that having an emergency fund is what they would like to do with a raise. We said, if you got $1 an hour raise, what would you like to do with it? What are your top financial behaviors you'd like to see changed? And building an emergency fund was the top vote getter on that. And so based on that, we worked with two small companies in San Francisco. One was a janitorial service, another was a workforce development organization that helps people become receptionists and kind of front office staff. And so we decided to focus on this issue of emergency savings and helping their employees use this moment of the raise to build their emergency savings. And we did kind of very low cost. All we did was we used some behavioral economic principles around social proof and that Ray mentioned and nudges, and changed what the letter said that they all got about their raise, and changed the direct deposit form. So we made the direct deposit form specifically say save money, and specifically have that the first option, and had all sorts of other kind of behavioral kind of design techniques to make that happen. So not a lot of effort. And what we found when that letter and that new direct deposit form went out, a third of the staff came into the HR office and said, I want to know more about how I can start saving with this raise. And we did it all a couple of weeks before the raise went into effect, so they didn't actually see it in their paycheck, which is another kind of key behavioral thing. Once you see that money, it's hard to give it up, right? So, and so we were, so a third of them actually went in and said, yes, I want to start saving my raise. So we really think that there's something to be done there. Is that my phone going off? Oh, God. There's an embarrassment. Go ahead and just turn it off. So that's one thing that we really were really impressed with in terms of that pilot. The other pilot we did, they had a payroll card. Do any of the employees here offer a payroll card option instead of a direct deposit option? No. So there are many lower wage workers who don't have bank accounts, and that's a whole other talk that we can do about why there are so many people who don't use bank accounts. So oftentimes people offer a payroll card, and many payroll cards have a savings option on them. So again, we did a very simple we actually held a workshop around how do you start this savings pocket on your payroll card? And we saw in the 3 months after we had the workshop, 150% increase in the use of the savings pocket on their payroll card. So again, very kind of practical, easy things that actually got people to start saving in the way that they wanted to. They wanted to save for emergency. One of the employers offered a match on their retirement. They offered a 3% match. Not a single low-wage worker took up the opportunity to get a match on that retirement, because that's not what they wanted. That having restricted retirement money they couldn't access wasn't going to help them with their financial security. Having a cushion is what they wanted to be doing with that money. So I think that that's really important. In terms of high deductible health plans, we again did a survey of people with high deductible health plans and said, talk to us about this. And what we found is there was a whole group of people with this plan who know they should be saving, but don't know how much. They can't save $3,000, $5,000. And what they said to us was, we just don't know what to do, so we're not doing anything, right? Have any of us had that experience, right? It's well known in behavioral economics. If you're presented with a choice and you don't know which way to go, you just ignore it and you don't do anything. So that's what a lot of people told us they were doing. And we said, so what would help you? And they said, what would help would be to know, for someone like me, right, a 50-year-old woman with a child, how much do most people have to spend in a year on health expenses? So kind of personalized data around what should I expect. They said, if I knew that, I would be able to plan better, right? And think about it, right? Amazon does that, right? How many of us get since you bought this, right, you might like this. Someone like you might like this. Same concept, but for understanding how much should I be saving for health expenses. So that's one of the things we're trying to figure out. How could an employer use their health data to help them understand, to say, your workers like you save this amount of money and spend this amount of money. We also found out that a lot of them said if we got an incentive, if they gave us a prize for savings, right, we were more likely to save, right? not surprising, right? Who doesn't like getting a prize, right? Whether it's a sticker when you're a 5-year-old with a gold star saying good job, or a medal if you're a soccer player, or, we all enjoy prizes. And we've done a ton of work around pricing savings. And over and over and over again, we know that the chance to win a prize incentivizes people to save money. And so it's the same here. In some ways, retirement matching is a prize, right? You save for retirement, and you get a match. It's a form of a prize. And what we have found is almost no employers do this for health savings. The concept of matching health savings, we have found a few, but that is not the norm. In fact, half of employees don't even offer health savings as an option, even though they offer high deductible health plans. So we think there's a huge opportunity for innovation around helping people understand how much to save, and then incentivizing them to do that savings. And so we're excited. We're looking for thought-provoking employers to pilot with us some of these new innovations.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, I mean, just so much to say there. Really, really interesting work. And this notion, as I said in my opening remarks, right, of thinking about the moment in which you can engage employers about doing something, right? There's really no better way to think about that than with the motivation of a raise, right? And so really fascinating to see the results of that work as it goes forward. All right, now round 3. Talk a little bit, again, starting with Chad, like you guys are doing these great things. What about the challenges? What are the barriers that you're seeing to doing this effectively, or perhaps doing more of it? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think our field, as we've been talking about, the cost of care is so challenging. Even as we go into this year, I think we know our families are stressed financially, and we'll have a rate increase at the end of this month that maybe is going to be 3%, and I'm projecting wages and benefits going up 5.5%, but that can only last so long. You can't stay in business if you keep doing that when a majority of your expenses are in that category. We've been fortunate our programs have been very full. That's the only way we can make these numbers work. And so for me, it's what can I do on limited resources? And what we've been continuing to put it in wages because it affects everyone. But I mean, every time I sit down with our CFO and our leadership team and say, look, here's how much new revenue can come in from a rate increase. What do we want to do? There's 200 things on the list and we get to 3 or 4 of them. I mean, there's so many things we'd love to do. So it's really finding out what are the ones that create value. And with Kelly, we're looking, Kelly Black back here, our Director of Benefits, we want to identify if you are on our health insurance program, are you more likely to stay than the turnover in other areas? If you're getting childcare discounts, are you more likely to stay? And I could say that's the number one for us at this point. What are the things that we can offer that help people stay? Well, financial security could certainly be one of those too. But I think what we've recognized, we just have to make it personal. I'll give you an example. So if you do go back to school in our field, your pay can go up 60, 70%. That's a pretty nice increase after we help you go back to school. But many times people are afraid to do that. Every time I go out to a tour in the last year or two and I see one of our schools, I ask the center director, who in this building do you want to go back to school? And I personally, when I go into the classroom, say, your center director told me you are incredible with children. We want you to make this a career, and we want to help you go back to school. I even, when I bring visitors, sometimes help them do that. I was fortunate I had the head of the Office of Early Learning for Governor Dayton was with us in one of our inner city centers where we're doing a lot of work with low-income children, and there was a person, they happened to send their kids to school together. And I said, you help me. We've been trying to get her to go back to school for like 6 years. And I think it's the same with benefits. I think you really have to have these moments where you're not overwhelmed or scared. It's not some big sheet or the first day in orientation when you're hearing a million things and you're overwhelmed. Make it personal, and I think that's what Kelly's been focusing on. That's why director meetings where you're with your friends and colleagues, make it real, give scenarios that are real based on what wages look like. I think that's probably the best we're going to do. And if it's personal, and I think if you treat an employee that way, they're more likely to want to stay. But I think it's more data for me that I think could be helpful about where's the next dollar best spent on benefits, wages, other types of things. And I think we can do a little better job of getting that data.
Yeah. No, thank you, Chad. And I would say it reinforces this whole notion of like what's financial wellness, right? In what's financial security, right? Because thinking about something, labels matter, but labels can also be a real barrier, right? So a tuition discount for a teacher for whom their salaries are not as high as you would like them to be, and their childcare costs are outrageous, like you probably couldn't make an intervention that has a greater impact on their financial security than that, right? So that pretty clearly belongs in a financial wellness bucket, but we may not think of it that way. And it also may matter less if you have a very different employee base. So I think this is one of the things for a field that we need to be sort of figuring out is financial wellness needs to be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But thank you, Chad. Natasha, I think you talked about some of the challenges, especially as they relate to like convincing younger workers that, A, what's an ESOP? B, why does it matter for you? But talk about, if you would, both some of the other barriers that you guys may be experiencing, and also, we talked about a little bit about this in our prep call, right? You guys are doing such amazing work. Where do you fit within the competition in your field? I'd love to hear more about that.
So some of the challenges, you said it right, it's educating the younger workers. And I don't know anyone who was 20 years old was thinking about retirement and retirement savings. And so that is just in general. And then you compile the ESOP on top of it, which is also a very complex subject. And so we try to break it down to make it really understandable. But one of the challenges that we have is, I'm going to use a term, most of our benefits are backloaded and not front-loaded. And so you have to be there a long time, and you have to wait till you can get it or are old enough to get it, and they're very backloaded. So although it's great when you retire, there's a portion that we need to do more with front-loading of benefits. And I think that's why, I'm here, is I've gotten some great ideas already of what we can do to help that. And also, too, with our team, helping them, I guess, understand that sometimes when you have been there a long time and they're seeing that ESOP growth, in a way it kind of creates a little bit more of disengagement or presenteeism. It's because they know, like, well, I'm not going to go anywhere. Even though I might not be happy anymore doing what I'm doing, my ESOP is growing double what I'm getting per salary, and I'm not going to get that anywhere else, and so therefore I'm just going to stay. It doesn't happen a lot, but we are seeing that, where some people maybe just aren't happy anymore in their role, or they want to do something different, but the ESOP kind of keeps them there, and that's not necessarily the intent of what we want. And so we have a lot of engagement, actually, in our newer employees, even though they have less value than some of our more senior workers, because they could be just burnt out or something like that. And then you'd ask them, where do we fit within our competitors? And that's interesting. I like to say that we're the best manufacturing company in the Lakes area, because no other company has an ESOP. But again, if we're losing employees sometimes to 50 cents more an hour, because the employees think it's a if-then. Like, a lot of employees say to me, I would rather only get 10% into my ESOP, and please give me a 5% raise. They're two separate buckets. And we can't take the contribution from your ESOP and apply it directly to your wages. It just doesn't work that way. It's different. We have repurchase obligations that we need to meet, and those are why we have funding levels at the 15%. So it's helping to understand that. But also, too, it does create a little bit more cost for our company. We have more burden rates for our team, because in addition to the health insurance costs and other benefits, we're adding another 15% on top for burden rates. And so that's one thing, is we have grown through acquisition. So we've grown organically, but we've also grown through acquisitions. And that's the one thing that kind of hits the P&L of an acquisition, is boom, now they instantly have an additional cost that they need to fund, and that's the ESOP cost. So sometimes that can be a little bit of a competitive disadvantage.
Sure.
If you look at it that way.
Yeah. Although it's interesting, right, in a climate in which, for many, many, many years, the sort of narrative has been, cost minimization, cost minimization, cost minimization. It's exciting to see a firm that's so committed to investing in its employers be growing as much as you are, and being truly committed to your workforce is really amazing. So kudos. So Melissa, a slightly broader view.
Yeah.
If you guys are thinking about this work, what do you see as the major challenges going forward?
Right. So, as I think many of us have said, building kind of an emergency savings fund is key to financial security and long-term kind of financial opportunity, not just because then you cannot use a payday lender, but also psychologically, right? How much more safe do we all feel when we know we have $500 in the bank, right? We feel like we're not on the edge. And we have tons of research that we've done and others have done that show the psychological well-being of having that cushion is huge, as well as the kind of actual having the money. So we really think this is kind of a key component. But I want to ask, how many people in this room, does your employer provide retirement benefits? Okay. How many people in this room offer some kind of health savings, HSA, HRA, FSA, DCAP, all of those alphabet soup? How many of you offer a savings, an unrestricted savings program through your employer? Need I say more, right? Mm-hmm. This is not a benefit that people think about, right? And so let me ask another question in this room. How many of you have a savings account? Most of you, right? When we survey low-wage workers, 45% do not have a savings account, right? And when we looked at the San Francisco pilot at the banks that folks were using, only 14% of those banks offered a savings product that had low fees and low minimum balances. So the reason they don't have savings accounts is they're not out in the market. So all of us can choose to split deposit, right? Many of us have access to that, but lower wage workers don't necessarily have access to that. And it's not a benefit that we think about is offering some kind of option to unrestricted savings. So the sidecar option that Aspen is doing is wonderful. We've been thinking a lot about, could we do that with a health savings account? Could we have a sidecar to a health savings account that provided unrestricted? Because people need the access to unrestricted savings as well as longer term savings, right? So we think that's a big challenge is understanding how we can help people through their employer save unrestricted savings, right? So imagine a world where someone could choose, I want my 3% match to my retirement, or I want my 3% match to my emergency fund until it gets to a certain level. Imagine if that was a benefit. Imagine what that would do to the financial security of your lower wage workers, right? Could that happen? Just a thought question out there. I think one of the other big challenges that we've seen is limited resources, right? I used to be an HR professional, and I had a ton of things on my to-do list, right? And trying to add one more thing, people roll their eyes at me. And so that's why I think it's important for folks to feel like it's doable, that it's not about necessarily adding more things to your to-do list, but doing what's on your to-do list in a different way. Using what we know about behavioral economics, using what we know about just in time, like when do you communicate? Onboarding is one of my, as Chad was talking about, onboarding. Can you think about how overwhelming the onboarding experience is for somebody, right? All of the paperwork, whether it's electronic now, many people do it electronically, or filling out the form. You have to do it on your first day. You're already nervous. Oh my God, I'm starting a new job, right? And you're asked to make all of these financial decisions, complicated financial decisions in that onboarding process. Imagine if we use some of our principles around knowing how people think to make that onboarding process a huge opportunity to help people build financial security. For example, one of the things we learned is that if you tell people they're getting $1 an hour a raise, they go, $1 an hour. That doesn't do anything for me. If you tell them you're going to have an extra $100 a month, imagine for yourself, what would it feel like to be told, I'm going to give you an extra $100 a month? That make you feel different than saying you're getting an extra $1 an hour, right? So imagine little things like that you could do different at different moments, whether it's in the onboarding process, open enrollment, at moments of raises, that's not going to add things to the HR to-do list, but will just be about doing them differently. So we think that's the big challenge, is helping people understand that this is doable. And I think finally, something that Chad said, something that Jeremy said, is proof that it works, right? We all can sit in this room and our gut tells us that financial stress is not good for our businesses, right? Having employees that are stressed is not good. Having employees who are up late thinking about which bill am I going to pay. Having employees up late thinking, how am I going to afford those new sneakers my kid really wants? Do they need them? That's another question. But, how can I give my child what they want? We all want to do that, right? We can all intuitively get that that's not good when that person shows up to work the next day. But we don't have good data that says if you have $500 in the bank, I'm going to be a better employee. And so we really need to build that. We need to have employers willing to pilot and test new innovations and then share that data with their colleagues and really kind of build a movement around the importance of this that's based on data.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. So we've got about a half an hour left, and I think it'd be good to sort of open it up and bring everybody into the conversation. While you're thinking about your questions, it looks like people already have them. If you guys want to share any, don't feel like you need to. If you want to share final thoughts before we go to Q&A, now's your opportunity.
It was making me think about financial security. One thing we have done that I think makes our staff feel comfortable, we allow rollover of PTO and we pay it out. And so every pay period, there are a number of employees that ask for it to be paid out because they had a problem with their car, they had some emergency, and for us, we have to replace staff when they call in sick. So it's, we don't want them to when they don't need to, but unfortunately, you don't also want people to come to work unhealthy or not take enough vacation time. But I was thinking, as you were talking, is there some other way to tweak that where it turns into savings or it turns into an emergency fund that could be available? Because we do have those situations where, replacing tires could cause significant stress for one of our teachers and things like that. But
and in Minneapolis, you need those winter tires.
absolutely.
Right?
Starting in October. I know, I'm from Chicago. Go Bears.
Yeah, I'm from Montreal, so we know winter.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, great. You guys have the mics. And if I would ask the one ground rule, if you would introduce yourself, and also if you want to direct your question at someone specific, please do so.
Hi, I'm Ben Horowitz with the Federal Reserve here in the Community Development Department. It was great to hear so many themes from this morning's talk woven into this panel discussion, and perhaps for Chad and Natasha specifically, I'm curious, the one theme that didn't come up was the racial disparities that exist in this field. And so I'm curious, in addition to talking to center directors and in all of the employee engagement work you do you bring an explicit racial or other cultural disparity lens to that work and consider it as part of your progress that you're making?
For us, I would say absolutely. We really want our staff to reflect the children we serve. So if you go to North Minneapolis, where we put a program on Penn Avenue, in a pretty tough neighborhood, you're going to see that. One of the great advantages of spending a lot of time hiring staff who are great with kids and then helping them go back to school, we see that a lot more in early childhood than we do in the public school system. Somewhat, the broken licensing system in Minnesota has helped early childhood providers like me too. But I think that is always something we're aware of. It's really healthy for children to see adults in their life that reflect them. And so we do take that. And actually, as I said, our non-white staff outnumber significantly than the Minnesota-based population. We pay attention to those things too. As far as outreach, we are I think for us, because when we locate in a community, you end up having many community members apply, that it almost naturally happens. But we do, an example on Rice Street in St. Paul, we ended up having a pretty large Hmong population. So we had to go in and we really wanted to have staff, not just for the children, but for parents that could translate materials, that could translate what's happening in the classroom with children. And so there are moments where we have to be intentional. And I know our staff in that area reached out to members of the Hmong community and said, where do we do some recruiting? So yes, I think we take it pretty seriously.
I'll be honest, we really haven't, only because in the communities that we are in, such as Detroit Lakes, which are largest, we don't have a lot of diversity. We often joke, you're either Norwegian or you're Swedish. And so we just really haven't had to put some focus in that, or not haven't had to, but we're just aren't in communities where we have a lot of diversity. So the answer to that would be no.
If I could just add one thing. So we did this survey of low-wage workers, and we asked them, would you feel comfortable sharing your financial concerns with your employer? And there was a vast disparity for African American and Hispanic workers in terms of their comfort with many few of them felt comfortable sharing their financial concerns with their employers. Now, we haven't teased that out about what that's about. We're going to do some focus groups to figure that out. But I think that's something just to think about in terms of when you offer financial programs to your staff around kind of engagement. Are they actually using the program? And might there be a cultural or a kind of other reason why some people might not engage around feeling trust in institutions, feeling trust with your employer? That seems to be a kind of key factor in whether people will actually do programs, is do they trust their employer, and how can employers build that trust? And there does seem to be a racial disparity involved in that. So something to think about, I think.
Absolutely. Other questions?
Hi, my name is Sharon Powell. I work with the University of Minnesota Extension, and I have both a testimony and a question. When PrizeLink savings became an option here in Minnesota, I really was pushing it amongst the families that I work with who are primarily low income, and just saying it seemed like such a great program. There's so much evidence that it works well for people. But finally, I decided it would work better. I just thought, if I'm telling everybody else to do it, I'm going to do it myself. So I signed up in April of 2016, and I have to say, it works great for me too. Not only, it's a great selling tool as well, because this past June, I won a lottery.
Hey,
so now I can tell people, yeah, it works, it's easy to do, and you can win. So I'm so happy that we have that available here in the Twin Cities or in Minnesota, and I'm constantly looking for other asset building vehicles for low to moderate income families that is unrestricted. That's a really tough thing to put so many restrictions on whether or not they're able to use the money in the way they see fit. That leads me to my question, which is, and this is based kind of on the content that's gone on all day so far, and that is that thinking back to the data that is showing that the difference in terms of financial well-being when you measure money set aside for emergency savings and that kind of stuff compared to this responsibility for a number of people within an extended family system, which is another way of looking at that is a really great strength. So maybe if you don't have emergency savings set aside, you do have the assurance that if you get into trouble, you have family members that you can rely upon. And they're not the same because our larger system obviously favors one over the other. But I wonder if there are any measures out there or ways of asking these questions that can provide a strengths-based approach to this. Because I feel like in the classes that I teach, frequently people feel ashamed of the fact that they don't have these larger amounts of money set aside, and they're not able to benefit or operate within a system successfully, even though the deck is stacked against them. So I spend a fair amount of time in my classes just trying to provide my perspective, which is that I think most low income families are excellent money managers. They just don't have a lot of money available to them. So how can we bolster their perceptions of the good work they do?
Thank you. That's a great question. Melissa, I'm happy to take a shot. Well, why don't I start? And actually, then I'm going to, Ray, I'm going to return the favor because I think you want to weigh in on this as well. Well, first of all, to your last point, right? I think it is this very, off-cited, I think, very misleading statement, right? That low-income people don't manage their money, right? People who are juggling the kinds of things that families with scarce resources juggle have to get really, really, really good about knowing, I got paid on Friday. If I don't have that money on Friday night, I'm in trouble. So I need a payment mechanism that allows me to get it, not one that, I have an employer who's, not Walmart, so if I get a paycheck, on Friday, the bank's going to hold it for 5 days, doesn't work for me, right? So people develop a lot of experience and a lot of skills in managing scarcity, right, which takes a lot of bandwidth. So I think that's one point. I think this broader question, the social network thing that I'd love to hear Ray talk about is, when you look at the data that shows how little African American families or Hispanic families have compared to white people, I think it's very easy to tell a story that what's going on is that Hispanics and African Americans are not saving in the right way. And we don't ever think of, well, perhaps it's because through their social networks, they're dissaving because they're helping out family members who also don't have the same kind of access to the institutions and structures, right? And I think, when you have this conversation when I have this conversation with a colleague or friend who's African American, it doesn't take long before you get the sort of eye rolling of like, you're the successful one, and therefore you have broader social obligations, right? And those broader social obligations mean that the $10,000 that was going here had to go here, right? And where that shows up in a balance sheet is you have less wealth, but it comes without all of the sort of social pressure that gets put on people or gets placed on other people that they're not somehow doing the right thing. And, I think that's not very well understood part of what's driving the sum of the racial wealth gap.
Yeah, I don't really want to add much. You said exactly what I would have, Jeremy. But that book I flashed up, Scarcity, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read it. But it's a great book because it sort of shifts the paradigm. The premise is basically people are not poor because they make bad financial decisions. They make bad financial decisions because they're poor. They have less bandwidth. Your intelligence literally drops when you face financial stress. So I think it's important to understand that. Having said that, I just want to reiterate the point. The U.S. Financial Diaries, I think, really proves this, that low-income people are excellent money managers because they're forced to be. And so I think, I think you can't underestimate that. Despite the constraints, they really are. And then secondly, on this idea of sharing wealth, it came out in our research explaining these black and white differences. I spoke to an audience of the most successful blacks in America, the ones who sit on Fortune 500 boards or are the heads of Fortune 500 companies. And they all called this the black tax. It's just a given that if you have wealth, you share it. One said, yeah, I'm supporting 10 people. Another said, I'm supporting 23 in my family because I made it.
Just add one thing. First, thank you for the shout out for Wincentive. So for those people who don't know, Wincentive is a program offered in credit unions throughout Minnesota and now in Delaware as well. They just expanded to Delaware that offers pricing savings accounts. So go to the Wincentive website, see if your credit union participates. It's a great program. They've helped in the year they've been operating millions of dollars be saved. So thank you for the shout out. I'll have to let the league know that they got that. And then just one, I think, final point is around financial decision making. It's not only that people share wealth, but it's also they make decisions as a household. So our survey found that 78% of low-wage workers make their financial decisions with their household, not as individuals. So I think it's a different sense of who is in your circle that you're making decisions with as well. And so I think that's something else for employers to think about when they're asking their individual employees to make decisions. Many of them want to be making these financial decisions with people in their household, however they define their own household. And so how can we help support that? Because better decisions get made if you can talk to people who you trust to help you make the right decision. So.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Kate Rissovy with LSS, Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota. And we've been providing financial counseling to individuals for 30 years, same as your organization. But since 2007, we've also provided financial wellness plans for organizations, including employers. And certainly learned a lot and continue to learn, and this has been a great discussion today. And one thing I wanted to ask the panelists, Chad and Natasha particularly, is because engagement in the program can vary, and we've learned a lot about engagement in the program because you can offer a fantastic employee benefit and it only works if people participate, right? And it can look really different in a large employer. So for example, we'll partner with a large statewide employer that has 18,000 employees, as well as a small, less than 50 people at a work site. And it's a very more familial environment. And then the shame and stigma of debt and financial instability really comes out in some of, especially in smaller workplaces. And because you both have relatively small employee-based work sites, I'm curious what you've learned about addressing that shame and stigma participation by, we've learned a lot in terms of how to engage and address that, but I'm interested in some of the things you've learned as well as employers at relatively small work sites.
Yeah, thank you. Chad?
I guess from from our perspective, I think it's trying to find opportunities to do one-on-one and more personal just discussions. But we do find our staff tend to share with our center directors a lot. We also have added an EAP that also would include financial wellness. So you can have those conversations that might be more private. But today has me thinking about what other opportunities. I think one of the things we didn't maybe touch on either is when the experts are leading certain areas like benefits, we understand it, but making it so darn complicated that people don't take advantage. And that's one of the changes we made this year with health insurance. We had 6 options. We thought those 6 different plan options were great because it could really help families in different circumstances. It's too much. I mean, even when I look at it, I'm like, just sign me up. I don't even, and so we've simplified it to 2, and they're really distinctly different, so you know exactly where you're going. But we also wanted to identify for our best employees what are the things they most likely do. So we got a lot of detail on what they used in health the last few years. And we want to make things like, that they're going to the doctor because you got something from a child in a classroom as inexpensive as possible, because those are the things. So I think it's probably thinking about, is there a way to make it, I don't know how you take the stigma away, but I think customizing and trying to individualize communication with staff would help, instead of a group setting where you're trying to talk about benefits, that you really talk to them individually. And when leaders know something's going on, that might be another opportunity for them to say, why don't I have you go talk to somebody in our benefits department? Maybe there's some changes you could make. If you're getting divorced, I talked to a staff yesterday. She came up after the retreat, and I had mentioned something about a child struggling because he was homeless and he was having huge behavior problems. And she said it warmed her heart. She's in the same situation because she's leaving an abusive situation. And she has to commute like at 4 a.m. to get her child somewhere to then get to our program. And just the amount of stress in her life. We actually already started today trying to give her supports. And we had emails going around about where should you go and how do you get closer to where your child is. And I mean, those are the kind of things sometimes staff are embarrassed, but when they do reach out, I think the best thing is to be really attentive so that rumor gets around. That when I had a need, the employer stepped up and does care about us as individuals. So I think looking for those opportunities more frequently might help too.
That's great.
I think that's great. I was just going to add to that too, is I think it's really from the leadership kind of top down is, we have a lot of humility and we're going to share our own personal stories, right? So employees know, like, I struggled, some days I still struggle. I mean, Absolutely. And I think sharing those stories, it gives them the opening of like, okay, it's not just me. And so I would say in general, we just are pretty much somewhat of an open book in that regard. I mean, in addition to sharing our company's financial wellness, because we do share it every quarter at shareholder meetings, we share it. And they know where we're landing, and so they even know as a company the months that we're doing good and the months that we're not doing well. Another thing that we've done is we've just tried to make as much as possible automatic. We are passive creatures by nature. And so even when we set up like a lunch and learn for a financial wellness topic and you have to go sign up, Nobody does. But the minute their name is already on the list, they attend. And so, we've tried to do as much as possible to make it automatic. Not, we don't want to use the word required, but as much automatic, because if they're passive and they actually have to do something to participate or to join or to learn, most likely they're not going to.
Yeah. No, I think that's, certainly somebody who does retirement work, that is the essential lesson.
Yeah.
Right? And then how do you tailor that to meet different populations and different needs who might not benefit from all of the tools that are there, right? Melissa, I don't know if you have any. Yeah, I didn't think so. But,
I have tons to say, but no.
We've still got time.
Hi, I'm Julia Quanyard, and I'm a volunteer with Prepare and Prosper, but I also work for Reading Corps and Math Corps, and I specifically supervise our tutor corps in Miami, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. It's about 400 full and part-time tutors. So I've been thinking about what can we do, because many of our tutors in the urban core do come from low incomes, and we're a typical nonprofit. We have many restrictions on how we can use our funds, and there are not a lot of funds available. So one of the things that really piqued my interest was the unrestricted savings option you talked about, and thinking about kind of how you design your direct deposit form and even offering that as an option. And then I had this aha moment where I thought, oh my gosh, I do that at Prepare and Prosper every week. And I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about how employers do that. What does it look like?
Yeah, thank you. When someone in an audience says I had an aha moment, it's been a successful trip, so thank you for that. You made my day. So I think it's simple. I mean, I think really thinking about what does your direct deposit form say to the person filling it out, right? So for example, one of the things that I've been talking about is how many of you send out something to people before they start working, right? Saying, bring these documents your first day. What are the documents, right? Proof of citizenship or proof that you can work, direct deposit slip. Everyone ask for that. How many people ask for your savings deposit slip? Bring in your savings deposit, right? I'm not seeing any nods, right? So things at the very beginning, say bring in a savings deposit slip on your first day. Could be one thing. And then on the direct deposit form, we actually had the first account be the savings account, right? So really simple, but the first thing says savings account, and there's all the spots for that, and then you had checking account. And then we had some language around how much should you save, right? And it was very specific to that company. We had done focus groups with their employees and knew what they were saving for and what they wanted to save for. Was almost all were Cantonese, so we had to have it translated into Cantonese. But it was very much about short-term savings. If you save $5 a week, you will then have X amount. And I'd have to ask my staff, but we had very specific, like, if you save this much, this is what you'll have, and this is what you could do with that money, based on the focus groups and what we knew people cared about. People wanted to save for back to school, for example. So we had some language and some examples of what you could save for. And there were visuals. So there was a picture of a gift, and there was a picture of a bicycle, a little kid's bicycle, I think, and a picture of books for back to school. And so we had kind of visuals around what savings could do for you to really get that sense of question. And that was on the direct deposit form. So kind of simple things like that can really encourage behavior change. Yeah. And making it automatic, I think, is key. So the expectation, the culture of our organization is everyone saves. And having that at the get-go, I think, can make a huge difference.
So Melissa, can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Or I should say, as the moderator, I'm going to ask a follow-up question, which is, I completely agree with all that, but help me reconcile especially for populations that we're interested in, if 45% don't have savings accounts, right? That immediately kind of ends the savings conversation, right? And I think one of the interesting things about sort of moving from long-term retirement savings to short-term savings is that by law, I as an employer can automatically enroll you into a retirement fund. I cannot open a bank account for you. Right? And so you have to open your own bank account. So that, there are reasons for that, right? I'm not suggesting we change that law, but that can be a real barrier, right? And so one, I'd love to hear, your thoughts on that. And then I think it's also worth teasing out a little bit of what Natasha was saying about this, the holiday savings program is such a fascinating idea. In an earlier career, I used to work for USAID and did a lot of work in Latin America. And in Mexico, where I lived for several years, the cultural practice there was that you got a 13-month worth of salary at Christmas, in time for the holiday season. And, and so if you hired a nanny or whatever, you had to budget for that second payment, right? And it just becomes part of the way that salary gets paid out, right? But think of that as like, what a great way to prevent people from going into debt at the holidays. It was, it's very simple, it's very low cost, and it's brilliant. So, Natasha, I would love to hear more about like what you guys actually did to make that happen that allows you not to have to open accounts for people and all.
So you made me, I just had an aha moment, but one of the things is when you said you can't open up a savings account for an employee, I would challenge that a little bit because we're opening up house savings accounts for employees all the time.
Yep.
And we just partner with our corporate bank. And if they come in and they don't have a savings account to slip, we have the savings account enrollment form right there that they fill out. We scan the ID, we send it in, and our corporate bank opens it. So that was, and now I'm thinking I should be doing that outside of here's your health savings account, but also do you want to open up another savings account with our corporate bank where, we have, discounts on fees and things like that.
Yep.
With the holiday fund, it was actually an employee who came to us and said, I want a way to save money. And it was funny, they were like, I want a way to save money that my spouse doesn't know about. And we just took that, we were kind of laughing about it, right? But it was kind of true, right? Like, I want to be able to save money because I would like to buy this person something, but it goes into our checking account and our savings, and then they see it. And then we started thinking about it, and there was another employer, actually the local hospital in Detroit Lakes, was also doing something similar. So we called it the Holiday Fund. I suppose now we could probably rebrand it. But every January you get a form, you fill out how much you want. It actually sits in, we like SJ, it sits in our account. Like that's why we tell employees it's a non-interest bearing account. Yep. And then we pay it out to them the first paycheck in November. However, if they have an emergency, they can withdraw it at any time throughout the year, but it's one withdrawal, and then we close it for the year. So we don't want it to be like, oh, I want $20 this paycheck and $50, because that would just be administratively difficult to do.
And is the idea, to quick follow-on question, so I'm going to contribute, let's say a total of $700.
Yes.
And it's March 15th, and I need to put new tires on the car.
Can.
I can draw down the whole 700.
You can draw down. Nope, you can draw down what you've put
what
in.
you've contributed so far.
What you've contributed. Yep, you can't overdraw it.
Got it.
So you can take out what you've put in, and then we just stop it, and then January you re-enroll. Another thing that we've done when you brought up the whole 13th month salary, we pay our employees biweekly, which means they get paid 26 times a year, not 24. Out of the 2 paychecks a year or the 2 times a year where you get 3 paychecks in a year, we don't take any insurance deductions. We divide our insurance premiums about over 24 payrolls instead of 26. So they instantly get a lift 2 times a year on their paycheck where there's no insurance deductions. We actually did that because it was easier to balance our benefit bill because it would match. But our employees love it because, our insurance for a family insurance on our lowest deductible plan is $200 a pay, $222 a paycheck. And so boom, they just instantly get, if they have dental insurance and other insurances, they could potentially get a lift of $300 on one paycheck or more because we're not taking those deductions out.
Great. Questions? Ray? This probably is the final question.
Oh, well, just
Have at it.
Well, it's really just a comment. I think from the research, it's also debt levels that families are struggling with, not just having liquidity and savings. Absolutely. So helping families manage their debts is important. Access to short-term credit and loans is important. I don't know if folks saw this, but household debt levels reached a peak in 2008. We had historic deleveraging until 2013. We've now exceeded the peak we reached in 2008 in terms of household debts. So debt levels are on the rise. Problematic areas are student loans and auto loans and now credit cards. So just keep in mind that it is, I think, emergency savings is probably the best strategy, but for many families, it's the debt management as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think I would just add, one thing to remember, if you're thinking about these kinds of savings programs, right, is that any savings program that doesn't come from some form of reduced consumption, right, is then just, then you're just squeezing the balloon, right? So I'm putting money away, but I'm making ends meet by borrowing a little bit more on my credit card, right? That's not a net plus, right? Not as an employer, but right as an employee. So very important to understand the relationships there. So final thoughts, anything you guys want to say that we haven't said yet in our hour and a half together?
ESOPs are great.
Yeah. Well, I would just say, when you think about doing this kind of work, like a more inspiring group of employers and thought leaders, I don't think you could find doing, in terms of knowing your employees and what they need and being there for them, in terms of really pushing the envelope, in terms of innovative and creative and not inexpensive ways to help people. You guys are doing really amazing work. And Melissa, Commonwealth has an amazing reputation for a reason. The innovation that you're doing around asset building broadly and financial well-being more specifically is incredible. So thank you all for a great conversation.
Thank you.